So let's start now.
You want me
A very, pardon, Rebecca. Let's
you want
start.
me to start now? Yeah.
No, I will. I'll just give a welcome note.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. All right. So a very good morning to everyone in India, and good evening to Ms. Rebecca Lim, our esteemed resource person, who's joining us from Brisbane, Australia. The year 2015, we witnessed a very disturbing image of a 2-year-old boy washed on the shore of a Turkish resort. The innocent boy's name was Alan Kurdi. His Syrian family was in the Mediterranean Sea that day, trying to move to Europe as refugees trying to escape the conflict in Syria. Their boat capsized as it was overloaded, and within 5 minutes of travel from shore. And now, coming to the year 2022, very familiar with all of us, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent exodus of people. The Oxford Dictionary gives the meaning of refugee thus: a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. Professor James Hathaway, an American Canadian scholar of international refugee law, defined persecution in terms of the sustained or systematic violation of basic human rights demonstrative of a failure of state protection. He further says, a well-founded fear of persecution exists when one reasonably anticipates that the failure to leave the country may result in a form of serious harm which the government can not or will not prevent. Persecution encompasses harassment from state actors as well as non-state actors, as we see, as it happened in Syria or as it happened in Ukraine. So, to put further light on this pertinent issue of refugees, today we have with us Ms. Rebecca Lim, a Brisbane-based migration and community engagement practitioner. She has worked in Australian government as an immigration officer and in the people from refugee and asylum-seeking backgrounds for more than 18 years. She worked in a refugee camp in Indonesia in 1980 and detention centers in Australia and PNG from 2010. As a volunteer, she traveled to India, Hong Kong, Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka, where she met with faith and non-faith based community groups and human rights activists and people from refugee and asylum-seeking backgrounds. Rebecca has presented at the UN Human Rights Council Geneva sessions in 2017-18. She is also the recipient of Meritorious Award of the UN Association of Australia in 2014 in recognition for her contribution in raising awareness and promoting human rights for asylum seekers within Australia and overseas. Further, she has published a book on the lived experience of Queensland volunteers working with people seeking asylum. Her book will be launched in April 2022. From India in general and the Aloysian College fraternity in particular, I extend a warm welcome to our esteemed resource person and guest, Ms. Rebecca Lim. I welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Next, I welcome our respected principal, Dr. Chako. Thank you. Next, I welcome our respected principal, Dr. Chako Joe, who is a great asset to our college and always encourages us to raise the bar by supporting programs of this level. I welcome you, sir. Next, I welcome Dr. Shelley Johnny of the Political Science Department of our institution, whose astute knowledge and analytical skills has contributed to the richness of the research culture in our institution. He will be moderating the question and answer session. I welcome you, sir.
Thank you.
Next, I welcome all the faculty from within the institution and outside who have joined this session. Last but not the least, I welcome all our dear students who are viewing this live session from our college YouTube channel. It is for you that we have conceived this program. I'm sure all of you will take benefit out of this and will actively participate in the Q&A session. I welcome all of you once again. I think now our principal is not able to join. I mean, he is a bit busy in a meeting. So let's go ahead with the session. I welcome you, Rebecca, to start the session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Really happy to share the experiences and what's currently happening globally. And I guess my experience, I'm trying to focus a bit on Australia's policy as well, because we have a lot of refugees here. So I'm going to share my screen now. And so I need to know if you can see the PowerPoint. Yes?
Not yet. I mean,
Not yet?
Yeah. Just have to take the.
Still not showing yet?
Not yet. I mean.
Okay. Let me try again.
Yeah. You can just share your screen and click the full screen. I mean. Yeah.
What about
It's
now?
come. Yeah. You just have to put it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's clear.
So I was asked to talk about the refugee crisis, I guess, a global perspective. The introduction is there, so I kind of don't need to talk about that. Sorry for the background noise. Got birds in the garden. I wanted to give you, I guess, background information on where we're at globally. So this information has been taken from UNHCR, which is the refugee agency in the UN. So the statistics are quite alarming, I guess, and it has progressively increased, over time at the moment. So these stats are the global trend, mid-year trends from last year, so up to June 2021. 84 million people were forcibly displaced. Of course, we know about Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine 24th February, and since that time, 2 million people have fled Ukraine. Generally speaking, apart from Ukraine, by the end of June, 20.8 million refugees. There are 20.8 million refugees, of which 5.7 million are Palestinians. 4.4 million people seeking asylum. That's an increase from the end of 2020 from 4.1 million. And 3.9 million Venezuelans have been displaced abroad. Colombia is hosting many of the Venezuelan refugees. And, the reality is that only 16,300 refugees have been resettled. Okay, so there are very, very few places for people to be resettled. If we look at the internally displaced people, of course, we all know that the fall of Kabul was late last year in August, which, has increased the displacements of the Afghans, people from the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's still a war raging in Ethiopia, Mozambique. We've got the Rohingya people who are the Muslims in Burma, or now known as Myanmar. We've got people from South Sudan, and of course, other locations globally. Alarmingly, we've got 30 to 34 million children who are displaced. So that is quite significant. The other important thing to note is that 85%, or 8 out of every 10 refugees roughly, are hosted in countries such as Pakistan, Turkey, Uganda, Colombia, and Germany. Also note that some of the countries hosting refugees are also refugee-producing countries, like Pakistan, for example. I wanted to give you a snapshot. I guess this is quite recent, right? And when I'm doing this comparative analysis, I'm not taking away the misery of the Ukrainians. Okay, I'm just doing a comparative analysis. Really, it's a bit of shaming Australia for its we're supposed to have a non-discriminatory policy, but I guess at the end of the day, these figures talk for themselves. So we know that many Afghans supported the Australian soldiers when they fought in Afghanistan. So we have a moral obligation, really, to ensure their safety. However, at a parliamentary hearing on 15 November 2021, Home Affairs officials, had still not granted a single humanitarian visa out of the initial 3,000 promised. Fast forward to January 2022 this year. Of course, I, among many other migration professionals and volunteers, helped people to be members. So we launched visa applications for more than 145,000 Afghan nationals across the country, not just me, but many of us. And we were recently told that 1,000 Afghans were granted permanent places. So we really could be doing more. 3,000 visas have been granted to Ukrainians since the Russian invasion. But having said that, it is not easy for a Ukrainian to leave the country. I mean, how on earth you get to an airport? There are no flights. So people will have to make their way to Poland and other neighboring European countries. So refugee rights, I think it's important to understand the UN Refugee Convention of 1951. And so in Australia, we, given our geographical location, I guess, we do have people who seek asylum by sea. However, that causes a lot of problems for them. So therefore, my title, How Does Australia Treat People Seeking Protection? It really depends on when and how you arrived. So how you arrived would be, are you able to get a visa, travel by air, or when it's impossible, and depending on the countries you come from. And we're pretty strict on how and who we grant our visas to. You have no options but to come by sea. So if you do come by sea, you are mandatorily detained in immigration detention. No question about it. If you come on a visa and you don't quite make it through the airport or immigration cleared, your visa could be cancelled on arrival. For example, you apply for a tourist visa, you're not deemed to be a genuine tourist from an immigration officer's perspective. However, if you ask for asylum, you will be able to, in most cases, apply for asylum, but you're taken to immigration detention. So, of course, people who came after July 2013, many of them were sent offshore to Nauru and to Papua New Guinea, an island called Manus Island, of which I kind of worked there for a number of years. Because I worked as a contractor, I don't talk about my time working there as a contractor because we, have contracts to sign. However, I do talk about my time as a volunteer. So as a contractor, I went from 2014, 15, 16, and by mid-2016, I resigned and went back as a volunteer to do what I needed to do on the ground. How did people survive in offshore detention? Of course, there were deaths, given that the level of health care in Nauru and PNG is very wanting, I suppose. Don't forget that people who seek asylum in some instances have already been, have experienced, torture, trauma, persecution in various forms. And if you don't get the right treatment, your condition deteriorates. So this is what we've seen in offshore detention, which really is a blight on Australia. So families and children were sent to Nauru in the latest round, and there are reports we call the Nauru files, exposed more than 2,000 leaked incident reports of assault, sexual abuse, self-harm, child abuse, trauma inflicted on children and adults. And as people were being medevaced or sent to Australia for medical treatment from these islands, the doctors who were treating the people were, I guess, quite appalled. In April 2016, the PNG Supreme Court found the detention on Manus Island was unlawful And so the Australian government had to pay compensation to many of the people who participated in the class action. There's a good report by the Refugee Council of Australia called Until When? The Forgotten Men on Manus Island. And yeah, that's not nighttime reading, but for those of you who want to do some research, that is a pretty good report to start from. And very quickly, I don't want to dwell on Manus too long, but this is some of the reflections from the people who, were subject to being forcibly removed from Christmas Island to Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. I've not done anything wrong. I'm not a criminal. I could not apply for a visa to seek protection in Australia. I had no option but to come by boat, which is what I explained earlier. Manus was so difficult. Many men got sick. I saw many things. I've taken so many pills to keep alive, and I've suffered a lot. This gentleman is now resettled somewhere in Europe, and he still has his demons. Another person who, a Rohingya refugee called Imran Muhammad, who's quite happy to be identified. He's been in the media quite a lot. He's now living in Chicago. He was resettled there in 2018. So he tells us the system the Australian government has designed for refugees and asylum seekers has a kind of evil and devastating effect. It can ruin the very inner strength of human spirit. To the outsider, Perebros Karami took his own life on Nauru. But the truth is the system took his life. There is no alternative explanation. And he says the Australian government needs to be accountable. It feels like the ultimate goal is to put every vulnerable refugee and asylum seeker into a corner. We have now lost 7 lives. It's gone up to 13. Just a little on the community development work that I did on Manus Island, predominantly with the Catholic Bishops' Conference, the Catholic Church, and St. Vincent de Paul people. So when the men were relocated to centers in Manus Town, so when the detention center itself was found unlawful by the Supreme Court, it was eventually closed. Many of the men were then forced to relocate to 3 centers in town. And of course, the Manus people were not given much notice except on a Sunday mass to say that from Monday, all these people will now be in your town. So from the end of 2017, I volunteered to work with St. Vincent de Paul and the community using fundamental human rights principles and community development strategies while negotiating with major stakeholders to try and create a more normalized life. So there was a lack of consultation with the community. There was a lack of information. The PNG people only knew, Australia was sending all these bad people to our country, and vice versa. The men who were brought on the plane to Manus Island were kind of given information that PNG people were cannibals and they were going to eat them. So from the very start, it was a very much a them and an us, lack of information. And I kind of wanted to change that, which I believe I did quite successfully in terms of informing both sides about who's who. And this is the situation that Australia has created. I also, on my own initiative, facilitated some training, very basic, 2-hour food safety training. It was an opportunity to bring the community together with the refugees, the men who, by this stage, they were in the community now for a year and a half. They made friends. The PNG people had only ever known the West Papuan refugees. They didn't even know where Afghanistan was, or where Sri Lanka, or where Burma, or where Iran or Pakistan was. And vice versa, many of the men who ended up in Manus Island didn't even know where PNG was. So there you go. You've got some pictures. The men's faces are blacked out. We've got Afghans, we've got Sri Lankans, and then we've got the teachers from the Catholic College. Again, part of the community engagement. So it was, travel to some islands and made friends and, in a sense, I guess, things eased up a little bit. There was a lot of violence initially because people didn't quite understand each other. And towards November 2018, with the cooperation of the PNG Catholic Bishops' Conference, we ran a panel discussion in Port Moresby, and it was quite well attended from students from many of the Catholic colleges, the religious sisters, the priests, the media. It was full-on media was there. And of course, in the bottom right picture, you've got the mayor of Port Moresby, you've got the Human Rights Council people, and PNG Immigration as well. And so it was an opportunity to raise the issues of faced by the refugees, and also how they were just kind of dumped there, really without any consultation. So the current situation is that there are, people were so sick for so many years, right? This is the 9th year. And so there was a piece of legislation brought about by the independents and many other MPs, not in government, in opposition, and independents, to bring about the Medivac legislation, which then allowed people who were really sick and needed treatment to be brought from Nauru and PNG to Australia. Unfortunately, it was repealed, within a year. It was repealed in December 2019, which is very unfortunate. So at the moment, there are 100 plus people who remain in Port Moresby. Manus Island is closed, and there are still 100 plus people on Nauru. I think my footnotes at the end of that slide will kind of give you some information. There is a resettlement deal with the United States, with Australia, so some people have gone there. And then we've also put in applications to Canada. That has started. But it really is, we've had to work so hard, the volunteers, and, thank the Canadian government for actually resettling people that Australia should be resettled. Of course, there are others who don't have any pathway, who are living in the community in Australia. So we continue to lobby, and people who have refugee status really cannot be sent home. International law says you have refugee status. Even temporary visas are sort of not acceptable. People need permanency. But that is the plight for thousands of refugees at the moment in Australia. I put a couple of slides up about COVID-19 women and the increased rates of family violence, because, of course, it's had an effect on the women seeking asylum in Australia. Whether they've come by air or sea is irrelevant. They have been subject to increased family violence because of COVID. So this is some of the information that I've got here. There's increased reports of family violence seen in countries, during COVID: Australia, Brazil, Spain, UK. In Australia, we had 11% increase, and some of the factors there, which you will know, and you have access to the slides. But really, I kind of wanted to put this there because it's important, and I've got a case study in particular that I want to share that makes it, I guess, double difficult for women who are seeking asylum, COVID, and then, subject to family violence. So this is a case study of a lady seeking asylum from refugee background. She does come from a South Asian country. She arrived by boat because she couldn't get a visa, obviously. And so she, fled persecution, sexual violence and rape, societal shame, and family alienation as a result of her rape. So she married an Australian citizen and they now have 5 children. He wants more so he can control her, is what I'm free to say. And I know this for a fact because I'm supporting her. So family violence, but reluctant to leave because of perceived visa difficulties and losing children to child protection. This is a real fear, no matter how much we counsel women that we would try our best to advocate that they are not disadvantaged. This is their fear. The abusive husband worked during part of the lockdown, but he was home for many months. And so that exacerbated her grief, I guess. So refugee women and survivors of family violence and partners who have lost their jobs, increased alcohol consumption, and trauma is compounded by the refugee-like experiences of being displaced, sexual violence and rape during the war, uncertainty of future, and failed protection claims. So I guess for us working in this space, we are trying to kind of say things like no mandatory detention for people who arrive by boat. The narrative in Australia is about if you come by boat, you're illegal, which is wrong, right? Because the Refugee Convention does not discriminate you if you by your means of and mode of travel. And Australia is a signatory. According to the Australian Migration Act, you are unlawful, or you're maritime arrival, unlawful. So they call you illegal, but it's actually the wrong word to use anyway.
Excuse
And
me, Rebecca.
yeah, yes. Are you there?
I think your screen sharing has stopped. I mean, you have.
Yeah, yes, I have, because I've gone through the last screen, but I want to talk a little bit about
Fine, fine,
different
fine.
concepts I've
Perfect.
shared,
Thank you.
which the PowerPoint is free for the students anyway. I mean, you take it, right? It's yours now. But there's some key points that I wanted to kind of raise. The
Please go
narrative
ahead.
that we have here,
Please go ahead. Yeah,
if
thank you.
you come by boat, you're illegal, is also wrong. That feeds into the public discourse that somehow there's a them and an us. If you come by plane, you're okay. If you come by boat, you're not. And so this has, not been challenged by the media and used by the Conservative government a lot. And it's wrong. So that's why people are treated differently as well. And so people ask me, there is a queue. We have a humanitarian program of 13,750 people every year. We're supposed to take that. Now, there really is no queue. I mean, if there was a queue, we would say to the UN agencies, or, so the transit countries would be even India, right? In Tamil Nadu, you've got, thousands and thousands of Sri Lankan refugees living across 100+ camps. So if there was indeed a queue to come to Australia to seek refugee or to be granted a humanitarian visa, you would think that we'll take the first 13,000 that UNHCR has kind of assessed or processed, but that's not true, because Australia does cherry pick who they want. So, in a year, we might say we'll take 500 Afghans, 5,000 Syrians and Iraqis, and it goes on. So we try to correct that narrative time and time again, but it's also quite difficult when it's not in the public space and the incorrect information is out there. I think also the fact that Australia has reverted to temporary visas for people who seek protection is also wrong, because if you're a refugee and you need permanency. You need access to family reunification. You need access to permanent residency. You should be able to travel to see your family, not in your source country where you've sought, where you've run from persecution, but in a neighboring country. But all that doesn't, you can't do all that when you're on a temporary visa, which is what's also happening here right now. So alarmingly, the United Kingdom is using Australia as a case study for offshore detention. That means they're looking at, some islands outside of, London, the UK, to kind of throw people there. And so we're all like thinking, no, Australia is really not a good example of offshore detention. It's really quite horrific, because you have one country funding the detention and the healthcare, albeit there is healthcare, it's not effective healthcare, right? So you've got one country funding that, and it's in another country. So you've got sovereignty, which is where the problem has been for Nauru and PNG, whenever there's a problem. I'd really like to have a Q&A, because that's the only way, I guess, people can ask questions, and I'll try my best. I'm trying not to be so political, but I can't help it, because we're seeing it on the ground. Yeah, we're seeing the impact of bad policy. Bad policy causes a lot of harm. And I've given you a short PowerPoint presentation. The facts are all there. Look it up. The references are there. But let's have a discussion now. No question is dumb, okay? So just ask me. Moderator?
Option.
Do we want to start the question? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Melanie.
Sure, thank you.
you very much. Good afternoon, all. Thank you, Dr. Rebecca. I would like to thank you for a very detailed presentation on the specific situation of refugees wishing to enter Australia. And also you hinted at the general situation, the worldwide situation of refugees in 2021 and the beginning of 2022. So we got a kind of comprehensive understanding about what is the global situation. I would just like to start off the discussion by just raising one general issue, and along with it, a more specific, after that, a more specific issue pertaining to the situation in Australia. The general question that I would like to raise, and I would like to get your opinion on this matter. Do you feel that the issue of refugees is often deliberately disconnected from the larger issue of the global economic imbalance among the developed nations and the developing and underdeveloped nations with regard to the economic inequality continuing to exist in the global international system, the wars that are being waged by the superpowers in different parts of the world, and how all of this is contributing to the general refugee crisis. For example, if the kind of neoliberal globalization policies that have been implemented at the global level and creating economic problems for countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia, how they continue to contribute to the refugee crisis. But somehow these issues are maybe if it's deliberately disconnected from the refugee crisis and how it contributes to the refugee crisis, including the wars fought by the United States, NATO, and Russia, and so on. So how these issues are deliberately disconnected from the refugee issue, how it contributes to the refugee problem. Do you feel that there is a deliberate attempt to disconnect these issues from the refugee, the global refugee crisis? The second question is pertaining to Australia. Do you feel, I'm, as far as I understand, I think this is what you have been hinting at with regard to the situation in Australia, that there is a deliberate dehumanizing of the refugees coming to Australia, so that it becomes all the more politically easy to kind of take these repressive measures against people seeking asylum in Australia. So, these are the two questions which I hope we can start off with the discussion. And a word to the students. I would request the students to type your questions in the chat box so that we can take them one by one, and then we can continue the discussion from there on. Thank you.
Thank you. So my first point to make really is that refugees are not the problem, okay? It really is conflict and lack of peace building that creates refugee flows, right?
Yeah.
So the narrative really is about, oh, you're an economic migrant, or you're an economic refugee. I mean, if we look at the cycle over so many years, so I guess there's always this disconnect between who is a migrant, who is an asylum seeker, who's a refugee. Sure, people want safety and people want a better life, whatever that might mean. A better life could be, I want to feed my family, I don't want to be in jail, I don't want to be tortured. Australia is quite isolated, I suppose. We're this little island, so we're not kind of in Europe, we're not there. We get the people who fly or come by boat, right? So we don't kind of get the numbers like Germany hosted 1 million asylum seekers. We freak out when there's 40,000 people who come by boat, right? And that's really quite shameful, yeah, because we're such a large country, and we know that multiculturalism and migrants contribute to the economy. When I hear people say, oh, I don't want them to come because they're taking my jobs, I say, well, will your son work in a meat factory? Will your son work in an aged care home? No, you don't, right? You're not, so no one's taking your jobs away because you're not doing these jobs, So that for me is a situation. I always say refugees are not the problem. It's all that kind of stuff that's going on. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but certainly, we have people saying, oh, you're here because, and you know what, you pay a smuggler, so you're rich. Not necessarily. No, not all refugees are barefoot pregnant in the village. I had a client who was a professor in Tehran University, right? I've got refugee clients who are across the spectrum. When you flee, you flee. You can be educated, uneducated. You can be a professional. You can be a tradespeople. I mean, at the end of the day, you're fleeing because of persecution. And the whole thing about war is very interesting because if you fled because of war, some of my clients fell from a particular country because that's what they claim, or the women were raped, right? But the immigration comes back, and I was in immigration, so I know how they're thinking. Well, rape is a consequence of war. That happens during the war. So we're not going to give you refugee status because that's war. So that's quite appalling, right? So all these visas that we're giving to people because of war, let's see whether it's a temporary basis, whether it leads to a permanent basis. I don't know. Now, the narrative, the demonization, the dehumanizing is deliberate to create that sense of we're being invaded by brown people who are not like us, who have a different religion, who have the money to come. They could be, they're not deserving because we have people waiting 20 years in an African refugee camp. Everyone's situation is different, right? Everyone's situation is different. If you have to run, you have to run. Yeah, I mean, in some countries, the people who might be in Kenya and Kakuma and Uganda probably don't come here. They try to go to Europe. It's just geographical as well. So, I guess we've become more conservative. We've become quite terrible. I mean, we've got a humanitarian program. Yeah, that's great. When we grant visas to people, they come here, we give them up to 5 years of settlement support and all that kind of thing. But we're really angry with the response to the Afghans because the drivers worked for us. They worked in the Australian embassy as drivers, interpreters, cleaners, cooks, and at grave risk to their lives and to their families' lives. And we had notice of it, months before the fall of Kabul. And people are still stuck there. Yeah, now it's getting more and more difficult. But having said that, there have been flights out of Kabul. So I think it's just the political will.
Actually, should we have requested the students to post questions on the chat box, but we have also so I can just read some of the questions. The first one question we have from Punya V is can active employment schemes by Australian government bring out a major difference in the settlement issues of the refugees in Australia?
So there are, again, if you come on a humanitarian visa, you get 5 years of settlement support. There's lots of, because you come on a permanent visa, you have access to a whole range of employment schemes, but not everyone's ready to work. Yeah. So it really depends. It's quite similar to the typical migrant story. I have had doctors from the former Yugoslavia who would never get registration as a medical doctor because whether it's English or having to take the Australian Medical Council exam, it's just not possible. So they're working as cleaners, right? I mean, there's no even bridging thing, right, for them. So it's not for the want of, I guess there is some effort, but it's also the Australian companies who are reluctant. Even migrants have this problem, let alone you're a refugee. The typical migrant story would be, oh my God, you haven't got any Australian experience, despite having worked in an international hotel, international chain for like 20 years, or you haven't got Australian experience. So the average migrant, is kind of, is very challenged with that, let alone a refugee. Yeah.
We can, I'll just raise another by Sneha Ramesh. What does it mean to humanize a cause? How can we help to humanize the refugee crisis?
By calling them by their name, by calling them people. We don't use the word asylum seekers. We use people seeking asylum. People who were sent to Nauru and PNG were known by their boat number. So there's 3 alphabets, ABC, and then there's 013. That is what you're known as. So when I had, correspondence with immigration, they always asked me for the boat ID. And I said, I have no clue. This is the person's name and date of birth. So this is how we humanize people. We don't call them asylum seekers. We humanize them, and, we always ask, the media is always saying, oh, we want a story. We want to humanize them. But there's fear, this is global, right? So, even when your names are published in your country, I was kind of watched in Geneva by the Sri Lankan forces, so I'm a white person, and I don't even have to go back to Sri Lanka right now, but we're watched. Everyone is watching everyone. So it's quite tricky to give your name and your story. Often we give pseudonyms, but the moment you mention, I've worked for the forces, I'm a human rights worker. So to humanize them is to call them by their name, is to give real life stories, which is quite tricky because of people's privacy and confidentiality.
I'm sorry, I don't want to compare, but when you mentioned, when this question was raised and when you provided your answer, I just came to mind though it's not similar, it's not the same case. I definitely agree that is during the Holocaust, where people were just given numbers rather than their names were just forgotten, and it just came to mind suddenly.
Exactly, and Oskar Schindler, right, who was a German, helped so many people. He was a smuggler. If you put that in perspective, what's wrong?
That's right.
That's the only way out. That's the only way out. You're not being trafficked. Trafficking is different from smuggling. Yeah. So thank you for raising that. Yes.
Yeah. So there's another question that's coming up. It's again by Punya. It's Ukrainian refugees are seen, welcomed with open arms, but the same is not seen with people fleeing other war-torn countries. So what is your view over this issue?
And this is why I put that slide up. I don't want to take away the misery from the Ukrainian suffering, because I myself have donated, to Jesuit Refugee Service and all that kind of stuff. But, it really is quite telling now that there's a black and white issue, that we do have, at the end of it all, we do have a discriminatory policy. And when we took in the Iranians and the Syrians, the Iraqis and Syrians, they were mainly Christians. We had a special intake program. So why did we say that? I'm a Catholic, but irrelevant, right? You're saying that you've got a quota or a queue, then do it properly. That is my view, is that it really should be equal access for everyone.
That's right. No, it's actually interesting that you mentioned this point, because then it raises the issue where civil society has an influence on policies with regard to refugees and how they are differentiated on the basis of their ethnicity or religion or some other reason. So within, civil society actors within Australia might be having an influence on how the refugees are categorized and how they're prioritized, and the policies are different on that basis. So
this is a conservative government. It's not so much. Many of us who are, not even kind of me on the left, I suppose, but even the people in the middle ground are saying, hang on, the Afghans worked for us, they fought for us, they died for us. How come we're not helping them? So there's this, I don't want to say more about that, but it's clearly racist. It's clearly racist. Let's call it out for what it is. It's racist.
Okay. We have, by Francie Francis, how does the refugee resettlement process work in the US?
In the US, look, all I can say is that Australia and the US government struck a deal in the final months of Obama, I suppose. He kind of said, what happened behind the scenes and what's happening behind the doors, who knows, whether Australia paid, whatever. But the US agreed to resettle 250 people from offshore, from Nauru and PNG. So that's how Trump called it a dumb deal, but he honored it anyway. So a few hundred people have already been resettled, maybe 6, 7, or maybe up to 1,000 people. I think there's still room for 250. So there's a settlement agency. They try to, if you're granted refugee status and you pass the interview by the US government and you have relatives, they try to send you to your friends or relatives. If not, they'll send you to other states where there are settlement agencies. You get up to 6 months of support. After a year, you can apply for the green card, which gives you permanent residency, and then you can sponsor your family. So people have been there for maybe 2 to 3 years now. Not everyone is coping. Majority are doing quite well, but those who have a significant disability are not coping because there is no equivalent of universal health care like we have in Australia, New Zealand, Canada. We have universal health care, which means you are looked after. So, yeah, but anyway, it's a pathway for people.
Yeah. There's again by Sneha Ramesh. Do refugees receive higher welfare benefits than Australians?
So I don't call them welfare. I call it social security. No, they don't. If you are granted a permanent visa through the humanitarian program, and you are unable to work, or you have to attend English classes and be resettled, and to settle properly, you can access social security benefits. If you are on a temporary visa, you've come by boat, it's significantly reduced, if at all. So people who are now on bridging visas, because they're kind of waiting to go through the courts and review, some don't even have work rights. And if you don't have work rights, you starve, you die on the street. If it weren't for volunteers, the Christian churches, the ordinary Australians who would, and the Red Cross, and the individual state governments. So Queensland government has provided some funding. And if you don't have a Medicare card, which is the universal health care, there is an agreement that you can still go to the state hospital for free during COVID and even pre-COVID.
Okay.
So it's us taking on the responsibility of the government that's using our taxpayers. Yes.
Yeah. Next. Yeah. There are some other questions. Yeah. How is the current refugee crisis in Ukraine different from others?
I have no idea. I've never been to Ukraine.
Okay,
I guess
okay.
from what I'm seeing is that I think the Russian president has miscalculated because he's really brought all the countries together. I mean, it is right, quite unbelievable, quite I guess reassuring in humanity that Polish citizens are opening up their homes. They've even got this whole organization of volunteers who would kind of sit at the border, arrange transport, arrange healthcare. It's quite, the response has been quite amazing, I guess, because of this person trying to think he can take over a country. I guess it's been immediate. It's been very quickly. There is an Israeli religious person, I forget what you call them now, but he knew months before this could happen. He arranged to get a whole group of orphans out from Ukraine.
Oh,
But he knew because he had experienced the Holocaust, no?
yeah.
So
Yeah,
he
that's
was
right.
anticipating this was going to happen. So actually, the response has been quite good.
Yeah.
I guess we'll see now what will happen. But there's so many brave people staying back and fighting. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you're sending. Yeah. Okay. What is needed to address the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine? Yeah, that is another question.
No idea. I guess the Ukrainian president Zelensky. Everyone's got huge admiration for him. He's doing really well.
Yeah,
In
yeah.
terms of getting support for his country. Look, the humanitarian crisis, I think, is being met. If you can get across the border, it's being met by all the neighboring countries. Inside itself, I mean, Kiev, they just had a delegation, right, of presidents or prime ministers from other countries that have actually met in Kiev. So, I can't answer that. It's the best that I know.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So many questions about Ukraine.
Yeah.
Is there any benefit for the countries
who accept refugees?
Look, like multiculturalism, you're a better place for it. There's diversity. You actually create more employment. Sure, there are refugees who probably may never be able to work, who may take a long time to master the English language, but that's few and far between. Generally, there's a lot of skills. But I mean, so what if you're illiterate? You contribute. We want to be part of the global community. this is being part of the global community. Okay, no one's going to take your job. No one's going to take over all this kind of stuff, right? I mean, Australians love to eat pasta and Indian curries, so you can't just have diversity in food. Yeah, diversity means diversity all around.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's how all these refugee crises would impact UN SDG agenda 2030.
What a clever question from a PhD person who's a doctor. I don't know. I haven't read it. Very sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, so we can pass on to
Dr.
the next.
Levison KB.
Yeah, Dr. Lewison KB.
You can tell your students.
Yeah.
I assume he's a teacher.
Yeah, he teaches.
Of course he's a teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course he's a
from
teacher.
the Commerce Department. He's from the Department of Commerce in our college. So he's also very interested in this discussion that's going on. So he just raised this question. So there's another. Yeah. Any more questions? If there are any more questions by students, they can raise them in the chat box. So I just wanted to, based on what we have discussed right now, in fact, it's quite interesting. Two things that I wanted to get your view on. Basically, one is we know that a lot of nation states that we have, be it in Europe, or I mean, especially North America, Canada, Australia, a lot of these countries have actually developed on the basis of immigrants coming in and building the economies and societies. And we know that this has been there even in the early 20th century, right down, I mean, even to the present times. But now, has there been a kind of hardening of their identities that is based on the fact that, okay, this is our core identity, and we don't need to accept, people from divergent cultures now, because our identities have been frozen. They have been kind of fixed, the fixed borders and fixed identities, and we don't need immigrants anymore. Has there been a hardening of these kind of self-identification and definition of borders and who can come in and who cannot come in? And is that having an impact on the refugees or the people who seek asylum in these countries now? So my question is basically, has there been a hardening of identities and borders in comparison to the 20th century, the early 20th century? Are we seeing a hardening of identities in the present scenario? And the second question is, we know that the United States have been involved in wars in West Asia, in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, and so on. But America often does not have to suffer the consequences of people fleeing these wars. I mean, mainly they try to flee to Europe, or maybe even because of I don't know if I'm spelling it out rightly, if there is greater access to Australia and so on as compared to North America. So in some ways, is there a situation because of geographical reasons where America is kind of protected from the kind of conflicts that it has initiated? And some of the conflicts might not be directly initiated by the United States, but is a fallout of American intervention in certain regions, and there's a larger fallout of that intervention in the wider region, and accordingly there are a larger number of refugees from countries which are affected. So is America some way shielded from these more and more refugees coming to different parts of going to different parts of the developed world? That is my second question. Yeah.
Look, I think if you start with the States first, I mean, their borders would be like Mexico and, that kind of thing, right? So, in terms of other refugees, it has to come under the resettlement program. Very few people, I suspect, will get a visa, go there and then just apply for protection, unlike the UK. People will fly, and the UK is very generous. I mean, now the Conservative government again, wanting to offshore stuff. But generally, if you can get to the UK, So yeah, of course, the US is quite shielded, right? Because they don't get boat arrivals like we do, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Australia. So we kind of
yeah,
got, and of course they're in every war, right?
yeah, yeah,
But they actually take more refugees, I guess, per capita than many other countries. But how their refugee system works, I'm not sure. But they do get people from Mexico and across the border, from
yeah, yeah,
Salvador and that kind of stuff, yeah, and
yeah,
Guatemala, and then but they also do deport people, mind you, if they've
yeah, yeah,
committed a criminal offence. Your first question was about identity. So yes, there has been a hardening, but Australia goes through waves of refugees. So we had the Indo-Chinese, again on my slides, I've given a bit of a timeline there,
yeah,
the late 70s to the 80s, where we had Malcolm Fraser, and we had conservative government, but also quite, then Labour after that. But we opened our doors to maybe 100,000 Indo-Chinese refugees, that kind of thing. Then, but prior to that, we had the Greeks and the Italians. So we go through waves, and then we just persecute whichever wave it is, But then Bob Hawke during the Tiananmen Square, again, there were so many Chinese students who were there, and he just gave them all. He cried on national TV and just gave them all. I think because the narrative has been so demonizing of people, and then suddenly you have a boat full of Middle Eastern brown people, that's how the conservative government plays on people's emotion. So yes, it's been hardening, but I think the last 9 years of people suffering from Nauru, PNG, and here has got. I mean, I think there's a certain portion of the community who are so right wing, you'll never be able to change their mind.
yeah,
I don't even waste time on them. The Pauline Hansons, and I don't even waste time on them. I talk to, and then of course I don't need to convince people like myself. So I talk to the people in the middle, and I think there's been an understanding that why are we spending billions to punish people, and it's not like the boats have stopped. The boats have just pulled away, actually, and don't talk about drowning. Nobody really accepts the drownings argument anymore. Like we've become so tough because we're trying to deter people from coming because they're drowning and they're dying. Well, how patronizing, right? If we decide that's the only way we have to come and we are prepared to take a 50-50 risk, drown or live, then we're doing it, right? So don't use the argument anymore. So I think obviously with a more compassionate and humane center left government like the Labour Party and with some independents, things will be a lot more humane. Again, I think now it's a bit tough with COVID and maybe unemployment, but actually we've got a shortage of workers. We go through phases. Suddenly we're so needing doctors and nurses. We get them from everywhere, including India, right? And suddenly, Australian graduates can't find work. We can, the migration program. So we cannot make up our minds. It's poor planning anyway. Yeah. I haven't quite finished. It's a long conversation to have.
yeah, 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 I understand. Yeah.
You understand?
But thanks a lot. Thank you very much for
You're welcome.
providing your views. I enjoy talking to you about these aspects. It's not every day that we get to talk to specialists in the area and share get to know their perspectives on this very, very vital issue that is afflicting the entire globe right now. So with that, I end up. Is there one? Yeah. Okay. There's one more question that's come up.
But we've
Sorry.
kind of talked about that. How do refugees contribute?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
they're
yeah,
all about workers, right? And the benefits of providing support and protection is we want to be part of the global community, we need to do it. We've got refugees, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, who are not signatories to the convention but hosting us, and we refuse to take people from those countries. I mean, shame on Australia, right?
Okay,
So over it.
yeah, that's it. So I'll now hand over back to Melvin, who will be continuing from there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. It was a really, a very rich session. I'm sure the students have really benefited, especially, an international exposure when a resource person from outside India comes and talks. They get a wider perspective about things. So I'm sure students have been very well benefited out of this session. We are very grateful. I'm very grateful to Dr. Shelley for moderating the session and for all the students who have contributed with their questions. Our principal was supposed to join. He's a bit busy with a certain issue. But on his behalf and on behalf of our college, I really thank you, Rebecca. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. I've enjoyed it. That's fine. Not so much technical hiccup. That's good.
No, that's fine.
Nothing compared to, at least we got it. We got it done. Okay, great. No worries. Thank you.
Thank you. Greetings once again. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye for now.